Hello and welcome. Please take a seat, get cosy and enjoy a cup of terror. With me, Stephanie Valentine. Hello my spooky little pumpkins! How are you all? I hope you're keeping well. Thank you for joining me today. If you are new here, A Cup of Terror is a series where I talk about true crime cases, mainly Victorian and historical murder and true crime, or cases that have a dash of the strange, be that supernatural, to do with the occult, or just something downright odd. So, are you cozy? Do you have a drink? I've got my tea and my lovely vintage cup and saucer. I thought I'd do it properly today. Oh, and before I start, can I just say thank you for putting up with my really random lighting choices. You can tell that Mark, he doesn't light these ones because he does them, tastefully and sensibly, whereas I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm like, I like pink, I like purple, I like green, and I just have these random mad colours, and they may or may not work, but I don't really care. I just love the colour combo. This one today reminds me of there's a sweet refresher bar or something. Oh no, that's yellow, and I don't know. Anyway, it reminds me of some sort of sweet, this colour combo. Right, enough waffling. Let's get into today's case. Today we have one of Oxford's most famous murderers. She caused quite the scandal back in the 18th century. So we have Mary Blandy, who was born in 1720 in Henley-on-Thames, Oxfordshire, where she lived her entire life. She was born into a middle-class family. She was well educated and was raised to be an intelligent, well-respected young lady. She was the only child of Francis Blandy, who was a prosperous lawyer and the town clerk of Henley-on-Thames, and his wife Anne. Mary lived a very comfortable life. Her father, though, was very worried that she would never find a husband. She was intelligent, accomplished, and charming, but she was in her mid-20s and still unmarried, and was fast approaching the status of an old maid. I know, it's terrible, isn't it? So in order to entice an eligible gentleman, he exaggerated the family's wealth. He had a bit of a silly idea of advertising a dowry of £10,000, which he didn't have. That was a huge sum of money back then. It's the equivalent of around £28,000 today. His estate was only worth £4,000 though. As expected, the promise of a big dowry attracted a lot of attention, but all the potential suitors were rejected, except for one, Captain William Henry Cranston, who had popped up on the scene in 1746. Captain William Henry Cranston, mouthful, was an army officer and the son of a Scottish nobleman. Francis was very pleased. He initially thought that Cranston was a very suitable match for his daughter, and he thought his plan had worked. According to accounts, Cranston wasn't physically attractive, and he was about 20 years older than her, but he was charming enough to make Mary fall for him completely. It was all going well, with the couple being lovers for 6 years before intending to marry in 1751. Cranston even moved into the Blandy household for over a year. However, Francis soon realised that Cranston was not what he seemed. It was soon discovered that he was already married, having married Anne Murray in 1744 in Scotland, and he had a child with her. Mary's father banned her from ever seeing Cranston again. Cranston insisted that the marriage wasn't a legitimate one, and he was going to make things right, that he was going to get the marriage annulled, and he made several trips to Scotland to ensure this, or so he said. He wrote to his wife and asked her to have the marriage annulled, but she objected and brought legal proceedings against him. I should also mention that Cranston was the fifth son in the family, so the prospect of inheriting any family money probably wasn't going to happen, which is likely why he really liked the sound of that £10,000 dowry. Francis was outraged at all the scandal, and he was very vocal about his feelings, and he openly told Mary exactly what he thought of Cranston and forbade her from ever seeing him again. Mary and her mother didn't believe him, though. Mrs. Blandy had she had a bit of a soft spot for Cranston. Sadly, during all this drama, in September 1749, Mary's mother became ill. The family doctor attended to her, but sadly on the 20th of September 1749, she died of natural causes. There were some later on, though, who thought that Mary had poisoned her mother. Cranston came and stayed with Mary and Francis at the request of Mary. Francis was grieving his wife's death, so he had other things on his mind, and he didn't seem too bothered about Cranston staying. Mary soon told her lover about all the terrible things that her father was saying about him, and how he was very against Cranston and their marriage. At some point during that visit, Cranston mentioned a Mrs. Morgan, who was a cunning woman, a witch basically, back in Scotland, who made powders called love powders. He suggested that if he had some, he would put it in Francis's drink to try and improve their situation. He claimed that he'd taken some before and that they had worked, as he had immediately forgiven a friend who he'd never intended to speak to again. Cranston visited again in August 1750. By this point, Francis had lost patience. He didn't believe Cranston. It had been months, years, and there really wasn't much happening, and no confirmation yet of the annulment. He believed that Cranston was just stalling, and that he didn't really plan to leave his wife at all. It was a very tense visit for everyone involved. According to Mary's account, one morning, Cranston, who had brought along some of the aforementioned powder, put some of it in Mr. Blandy's tea. He'd been very cross and grumpy at breakfast, but by dinner time he was in a much better mood, and seemed to feel much more favourably towards Cranston. Proof that the magic powders worked? Sadly not. He told Mary that Cranston was no longer welcome at the house until he sorted out his marriage issues. Unfortunately for Mary and Cranston, the annulment appeal had been dismissed. The couple could not marry. Mary and Cranston kept in touch, and they sent each other letters. In April 1751, Cranston wrote that he had seen Mrs. Morgan again, and he would be sending Mary some of her magic love powders. Cranston sent Mary the supposed love potion in the form of white powders, and he instructed her to give her father the powder, which she would need to mix into his drink, and it would apparently make him change his mind about the relationship and give them his blessing. Mary was unsure that they would work, but she decided to give them a go anyway. Love powders weren't uncommon back then. They had ingredients such as herbs, mandrake root, honey, or henbane in them. Mary followed the instructions, and she mixed the powder into her father's tea. Unfortunately, it turned out that the love potion was in fact something a lot more lethal. Francis wasn't in the best of health anyway. He was 62 years old at this point and suffering with gout, colic, and heartburn. His teeth had also started falling out. Mary's father became seriously ill. Francis always had his tea in a separate dish to the rest of the household, but one morning his servant, Susan Gunnell, She drank the tea he had left. She was violently ill for 3 days. Another day, Anne Emmett, who was a charwoman, a woman who is employed to clean a place, a home, a workplace, etc., she drank his tea that he hadn't touched, and she became so ill she almost died. Now, when Mary heard that Anne Emmett was ill, she sent white wine, whey, and broth to her. Apparently, these were known cures for arsenic. Did she know that the powder was arsenic, or was she just being kind to a servant that she was very fond of? Mary didn't seem to kind of twig that the powders that she had mixed into the tea might have been the cause of it all. And if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. She seemed to think that the love powders were harmless. She wrote to Cranston, informing him that the powders weren't working. Now, did she mean not working because they weren't making her father change his mind regarding Cranston, or not working because they weren't deadly enough? She wrote, "I am conscious of the affair being discovered. When you write, let it be as mystically as you please." Cranston replied, and he told her that she needed to mix the powders into something more substantial where it wouldn't float on top. On Sunday the 4th of August, Mary asked Susan Gunnell to make some gruel. The next day, the servants watched Mary stir the gruel and then rub some between her fingers. That evening, Susan took some gruel to Francis for his supper. He became very ill during the night, in serious pain, vomiting and purging. Mr. Norton, the apothecary, came on Tuesday morning. He asked if Francis had eaten anything out of the ordinary. Mary replied that her father had only eaten peas. No mention of the gruel for some reason. That evening, Susan warmed up more gruel for Francis. Once again, he was vomiting and in a lot of pain. Wednesday morning came, and one of the other servants, Betty Binfield, brought down the remains of the gruel. Anne Emmett, who was working in the house again, ate some of the leftovers. Oh, poor Anne! She was ill once more, falling violently ill with the same symptoms as Francis. Susan Gunnell suggested that maybe she make a fresh batch of gruel, as the current batch was 4 days old, but Mary told her no, it was fine. No need to make a fresh lot of gruel. Susan had actually tasted a little of the gruel, and she had felt very ill. Mary suggested that maybe she shouldn't have any more of it because it wouldn't do her any good. More proof that she knew exactly what was in the powder? So, this all made the servants very suspicious. They examined the remains of the gruel in the pan, and Susan very bravely tasted a bit of it again, and was once again sick for many days. She was quite old at this point, so it could have been fatal to her. She was very brave to test it out and taste it, knowing it would most likely make her very ill again. The servants sensibly put the pan in a locked closet overnight. The next day, Susan took the pan, and Mr. Norton, the apothecary, was sent for, and he took the pan away to examine and test the contents. The following day, Mary's uncle, the Reverend Mr. Stevens, arrived at the house, worried for his brother's health. Susan told him of her suspicions, and he advised her to tell Francis. The next morning, she decided to tell him that she suspected Mary of poisoning him. He was understandably shocked. At breakfast, he tasted his tea, and he remarked that it had a bad, gritty taste, and asked if Mary had put anything in it. She acted very shifty, trembling and muttering that it was made the same as usual, but she hurried from the room. Francis threw away the tea and got a fresh cup. Mary seemed upset when she found out later that her father hadn't drunk the tea she'd made. Later on, Francis remarked, "It is my fortune to be poisoned at last." He said this to Mary, and he looked very hard at her. I like to think that he looked at her like this. Mary left the room, grabbed some of Cranston's letters and powder, and went down to the kitchen by the fire. And whilst she was pretending to be doing something else, she threw the letters and powder on the fire. The servants, who were on full alert by that point, they couldn't save the letters, but they did manage to save a folded paper packet which contained a small quantity of white powder, which they gave to Mr. Norton, the apothecary, later in the day. Francis was still falling more and more ill, so Mary asked Mr. Norton to call for Dr. Addington from Reading. Now, did Mary call for the doctor because she was genuinely worried about her father and was trying to save his life, or did she do it to kind of put up a front so no one could accuse her of not doing anything to help? The doctor arrived at midnight. Dr. Addington found poor old Francis in a terrible state. His tongue was swollen, his throat inflamed, his lips dry with angry pimples, his eyes were bloodshot, his pulse low, and his complexion yellowish. Francis told the doctor that after consuming the gruel on Monday night, he had an extraordinary grittiness in his mouth, attended with a very painful burning and pricking in his tongue, throat, stomach, and bowels, and with sickness and gripings, which symptoms had been relieved by fits of vomiting and purging. After drinking the gruel on Tuesday, he had the same symptoms, and his body swelled, and Francis felt like he had a huge number of needles being pricked into him all at once. The doctor had no doubt Francis was being poisoned. The doctor asked Mary if her father had any enemies, and she told him no. Everyone liked him. The doctor stayed for a day, and before he left, he took with him the paper packet rescued from the fire and the remains of the pan, both of which were given to him by Mr. Norton. Neither man knew for certain what the powder was, but they had their suspicions. Dr. Addington suspected it was arsenic. As he left, he warned Mary that she could be accused of poisoning her father, and that if he died, she would be ruined. You see, centuries ago, arsenic was actually used as a tonic, so that probably explains why the first time Cranston put the powder in Francis's tea, he seemed in much better spirits. That small amount perked him up, but as we know, arsenic is fatal if it builds up in the body. If they continued using it and a certain amount of the poison accumulated in the body, then that is it. Mary wanted to warn Cranston. She wrote to him, telling him that her father was very ill, and that if he didn't hear from her again, not to worry. She also told him to take care what you write. This letter never reached Cranston, as when she gave the letter to her father's clerk, Robert Littleton, to post as he normally would, he broke the seal and read the letter. He then read the letter to Francis, who wrote, "Poor lovesick girl, what won't a girl do for a man she loves?" Dr. Addington was very suspicious of Mary, and he questioned her, but none of her answers satisfied him. She was now confined to her chamber, and there was always someone on watch. She was refused access to her father, but one morning he said he was ready to forgive Mary if she would help bring Cranston to justice. He told her he knew about her letter to Cranston and told her they'd found her powders. He told Mary that he suspected her of poisoning him. She was very upset and begged his forgiveness, which he gave. She admitted to putting the powder in the gruel, but not the tea. She also told him that she did it not with the intention of harming him. She claimed that she really did think it was a love potion. Francis was so angry at Cranston, exclaiming that he had come to his house, ate and drank the best that he could afford, and he took away his life and ruined his daughter. When Mary left his room, that was the last time she saw her father. Unfortunately, Francis eventually died in great pain around 2 p.m. on Wednesday the 14th of August, 1751. Forensic evidence was still very new at that time. They didn't have the tools and the knowledge that we have today. However, Dr. Addington was determined to find the proof that Francis had died from poisoning. An autopsy was confirmed, and after all their observations, they concluded that the cause of Mr. Blandy's death was indeed poison, and they presented all their findings to the coroner. The coroner also took statements from the servants. Poison was the cause of death, and Mary was the one who had poisoned and murdered him. Mary, according to those that saw her at that time, seemed extremely anxious regarding her situation and her future, but she didn't seem to show any remorse or sorrow for her father's death. Mary continued to be kept under house arrest in her room after his death. One morning she found herself unattended, so she left the house and went for a walk around Henley, but the locals attacked her and chased her across the bridge across the Thames into Berkshire. She fled to the Little Angel Inn in Berkshire, where Mrs. Davis, the landlady, and also Mary's friend, let her stay. There in the pub was a Mr. and Mrs. Lane, who were complete strangers to Mary. However, she did confide in them that she felt she was more to blame than Cranston, because she was the one who gave her father the powders, and she knew the consequences. A confession of her guilt, that she really did know it was poison. Mary said that, she just wanted some air, just wanted a little walk, but others believed she was trying to escape. Soon a warrant was issued for Mary's arrest. Things didn't look good for Mary. Unless she could show proof that she was tricked by Cranston and had not known that the powders were poison, then it was not likely to end well for her. She said, "I am afraid I have burnt some that would have brought him to justice. My honour to him will prove my ruin." She was imprisoned at Oxford Castle. She took a maid and took quite a few possessions with her in preparation for a lengthy stay. She also took her tea caddy, lots of canisters full of tea. I understand completely. Look, if I was in that situation, I would want tons of tea with me too. Cheers. Because she had a high social status, she had an easier life than many of the other prisoners. I mean, she had quite a good life, really. She was allowed to have friends round for tea. She could walk in the keeper's garden. She could play cards. It was a lark. In prison, that was when she discovered that her father never could have paid a £10,000 dowry. His fortune was only worth £4,000. I wonder what she thought when she found that out. I wonder if she was angry at herself, at Cranston, at her father perhaps, and if she realised that it was all for nothing, basically. At Oxford Prison, you can actually see Mary's cell, and looking at the picture of it, it ain't half bad. Look how much space she has. Like, she has a bed and furniture. She wasn't being locked away in a poky little cell with a horribly hard bed. And it seemed like she got on well with her jailers and was well treated by them. But soon London authorities got wind of a plan to help her escape. The jailer was ordered to keep a stricter eye on her, and he put double sets of irons around her ankles and stopped her walks in the garden. The trial was held on the 3rd of March 1752. The trial was notable because it was the first time detailed medical evidence was presented in court on a charge of murder by poisoning. The trial was also unusual because Mary instructed 3 lawyers to defend her. At the time, defence teams weren't really a thing. Her father's doctor, Dr. Anthony Addington, hadn't been able to test Frances's organs for traces of arsenic, as the technology didn't exist at the time, but he was able to explain how the powder Mary had put in her father's food and drink was indeed arsenic. The evidence for arsenic poison was strong, but the evidence against Mary was all pretty much circumstantial. She denied giving her father poison, but she did admit to putting powder in his food and drink, explaining that it was given to her by Cranston and that she really did think it was just an innocent love powder. She argued that she didn't know that the potion was arsenic and that she didn't mean to kill her father. The servants gave evidence against her and told the court how they had seen her stirring the poison into the food and how they'd witnessed her trying to destroy the evidence. The trial was chaos, apparently. The crowd was loud and raucous with lots of shouting. No one could hear the judge as he tried to sum up the proceedings. It was that noisy. Mary argued and fought her case as hard as she could, and she was hopeful, but it did not do her any good. The trial didn't last long, only a 13-hour trial, and the jury didn't even leave the room to consult. Less than 5 minutes later, she was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. She was returned to Oxford Castle. Her jailers and their family were all very upset with the news, as they liked her, and they'd looked after her well while she'd been imprisoned. Mary allegedly told them, "Don't mind it. What does it signify? I am very hungry. Pray, let me have something for supper as speedily as possible." There was a great deal of attention from the press and the public. She wasn't like a part of high society, but she was from a prosperous middle-class family. She was well educated, and she had killed her father, which was a huge crime at the time. Still is, but you know what I mean. She was in the newspapers a good amount in the early part of 1752, and there were endless stories about her in the press. Nearly 6 weeks later, on Easter Monday, the 6th of April, 1752, at the age of 31, Mary was hanged for the crime of parricide. The night before the execution, she asked not to be disturbed. She spent the night in prayer, sleeping little. At 8:30, the morning of the execution, she was taken from her room. The gallows that she was hanged from consisted of a wooden beam placed between 2 trees. There was a crowd of around 5,000 that had gathered to watch her execution. She once more admitted to giving her father the powder, but she continued to protest that she had no idea that it was arsenic. Her last request was, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, don't hang me high." She was concerned that the men in the crowd would look up her skirts if she was too high. When Mary was cut down, no one claimed the body. There wasn't even a hearse or coffin nearby. Instead, she was carried through the crowd to the prison in quite an undignified manner. It is said that a blackbird perched on the beam during the hanging, and that no blackbird has ever sung there since. Apparently there's a little bit of a debate as to exactly where she was hanged. Some accounts say that she was executed outside Oxford Castle Prison in the castle yard. Others say that the gallows was set up on a raised mound at the west gate, which is not too far from the prison. Mary was buried in the early hours of Tuesday morning in Henley Parish Church, between the graves of her father and mother. The church sadly has been restored since then, and there is no trace of her grave now. So, where was Cranston during all this? Well, once he realised that she was likely to be arrested, he abandoned her. He never stood trial for his part in the death of Francis Blandy, even though he was the one who supplied the arsenic. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but it is thought that he escaped abroad to France, where he hid. He was adamant that Mary was in on the plan. He claimed that she knew exactly what was in those powders. He claimed that after her mother's death, and 9 or 10 months before her father's death, they talked about ways to get rid of her father. He admitted that he came up with a plan, but she had fully gone along with it. Cranston fell ill toward the end of November 1752 and eventually died on the 30th of November 1752 in France. A few letters from Mary were found in his trunk. Apparently there's there were a few sentences and comments that do make it seem like she knew what she was doing. Mary's story doesn't quite end there, though. It seems as if her spirit had some unfinished business. Mary's ghost has been seen in multiple locations around Oxford Castle, including the Mound and also the West Gate. Her ghost is also said to haunt the Little Angel Inn in Berkshire, where she ran to seek shelter from the attacks of the locals. The public, they were divided. Some believed her, many others thought that she was lying and that she was guilty. Was she a cruel murderer, or was she really just a poor, lovesick girl? This argument continued well after her death. In the 19th century, her case was re-examined, and people tended to be a lot more sympathetic towards her. Again, this is another very sad and tragic case. Her last words at the execution regarding not being hung too high to protect her modesty shows someone who was more concerned with her modesty than her impending death. Maybe she had accepted her fate and realised that no matter what she did or thought, she was going to be executed. Maybe she had accepted her guilt and accepted that she deserved her punishment. I do have to wonder if any of this would have happened if Mary's father hadn't lied about the dowry. Cranston wouldn't have wormed his way into the family in hopes of getting this non-existent money, and he wouldn't have made Francis outraged with him, and then this whole plan to murder Francis wouldn't have been put into motion. Again, this is another tricky case. Because they're historical cases, evidence is always a lot harder to come by, and you can't always trust written accounts. They're not always the most accurate or unbiased. What do I think? You see, at first I did kind of think that she was being tricked into it by Cranston, and that she was just so in love with him that she would do anything to be married to him. But then you read more into it, and some of her actions and the things that she said, and they were very suspicious. And then her little conversation with the couple in the inn in Berkshire, making it seem like she was, fully aware of what she was doing. And then her seeming lack of remorse. You'd think when all the servants started getting sick after eating or drinking the leftovers, wouldn't that make you think that's funny, this powder that I've put into their food. People have been eating this food and drinking the tea and it's making them ill. I don't know. She really could have just been so naive and desperate and fooled by Cranston, and she just overlooked it all, but God, love does make you do some stupid things. But do think that she was in on the plan. But one thing I am sure of is that Cranston is a complete and utter scoundrel, to put it nicely. He absolutely was only after the dowry, in my opinion, which would have automatically passed to him when they got married, according to the law at the time. Not that the dowry was real anyway. And he did admit to the plan to kill Frances. He admitted that he came up with it. And then buggering off to leave her to face her punishment on her own. Like, oh. I am leaning more towards Mary being guilty, though. But what do you guys think? Do you think she was fully aware that she was poisoning her father? Or do you believe that she really was just a lovesick woman who was duped into it? Tricky, like I said. Thank you for hanging out with me today and spending time watching this. I know it's quite a long one, but there was a lot to it. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I do have a second channel where I'm now posting all of my convention vlogs and horror movie reviews and stuff like that. So subscribe to that channel as well if you like that sort of thing. But for now, it's a goodbye from me, and join me next time for another cup of terror.